Well, lawyer and author and former federal justice minister Jody Wilson-Raybould has a new book. It's called Reconciling History, A Story of Canada. It's co-authored by lawyer and educator Roshan Danesh. And the book takes on the many inadequate ways the story of Canada has been told in the hopes of creating some new and some common memory. Reconciling History is being launched this Sunday at an event at the West Vancouver Memorial Library. The publication date officially is October 29th, next Tuesday. And now Jody Wilson-Raybould has been good enough to join us in studio. Hello.
Hello.
So nice to see you.
Really nice to see you.
This book has a very interesting structure because in the beginning of the book, you talk about the structure of a totem pole and the significance of a totem pole and how it relates to the stories of families and communities. That's the way this book is actually constructed. And tell me about using that as a way to walk us through this history.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. This book, Reconciling History, builds on my previous book, True Reconciliation, the learning and understanding of the history of this country from the time it was formed and before. And in this book, Roshan and I use the metaphor of the totem pole to do two things, to reflect the reality and the worldview of my people, the Musqueam Tsawwadenak people, and the lineage and the teachings and the history that we have as evidenced in the pole, but also it reflects the legacy of colonialism and the reality of that history and how it's been told in many different voices. What we seek to do with this book is to tell the story of Canada, not just from the voices of the few, but of the many, including Indigenous peoples, to tell of the varied perspectives and experiences that we've had.
For a long time in this country, I mean, stole the history. Very good. We've a little Freudian slip there. We've been telling the history of this story in one way. You know, it's the story of Canada ignoring everything that happened before that. CBC itself has been a big part of committing that offense, which is telling just the colonial history of this country. Reconciling History, this is a very different story of Canada. When you decided to write this book, I mean, how do you even begin telling your history of this country?
Yeah, well, I've had the fortune of being able to tell the history of my people through various means and within various roles that I've been fortunate enough to hold. But in terms of, I recently went back to Kinkum, which is the village of my grandmother, which is where this totem pole was raised back in 1936, and it was raised after the death of King George V. And within the pole, it's reflective of the Musqueam Tsawwadenak people and how we are all one, and at the time confronting the reality of what was happening to our people in terms of colonialism. So wanting to tell the story through the pole and do what the totem pole beckons us to do is to look at history from many different perspectives and experiences. So it was kind of a slog writing this book and doing the historical research, which I think was really eye-opening even to me and to Roshan to understand that how individuals felt and what they said in certain periods of time. And the book's framed around 4 periods of time as reflected in the 4 crests of the pole about, the arrival of Europeans, the onset of colonial laws and policies, and its impact on Indigenous peoples to the present day, which is reflected at in the totem pole at the top with the Thunderbird about the resurgence and the reality of having more conversations about what reconciliation means and how we're doing. So I like to think it's a hopeful book and coming to a shared story of Canada wherein people have learned and sought and really in detail understand that there are different perspectives about how we came to be where we're at in this moment in time.
What I got from it a little bit was that those perspectives are so different. The colonial perspective is so different. The whole way, the whole interpretation of history, the whole way people think, the way we think of ourselves and community and the land and all of these structures, they're so different from each other. When we talk about reconciliation, I'm trying to figure out how you bring the two together in whether real reconciliation is even possible.
Yeah, well, I think real reconciliation is possible. I'm a glass half full person, certainly. And what I have in traveling extensively around the country experienced is Canadians from all walks of life wanting to know more and wanting to know what they can do in terms of advancing reconciliation. And this is progress. We have made progress. We certainly still have a long way to go, but at the basis of it, and it speaks to what you've asked, is understanding that within this country we have very different worldviews, approaches to addressing issues, but we can learn from those differing worldviews. The reality of the legacy of colonialism is that we have these invisible silos or barriers between us as individuals because we fail to understand each other's experiences historically and today. So I'm hoping that this book actually draws out those different worldviews, allows and enables people to look, as we do at totem poles, from very different perspectives, and understanding those different perspectives is what brought us to this moment in time where we are having that vigorous conversation about reconciliation and what it means, the fear it creates in some people and the hope that it creates in so many others.
I always feel like Indigenous people, though, have a better understanding of colonial ways than colonists have of Indigenous ways, because Indigenous people have had colonialism imposed on them. They've lived lives as Indigenous people, and then they've also had their lives completely manipulated, torn apart, by colonial ways. So do colonists, do they have the ability to empathize, to understand, to go that distance toward reconciliation that Indigenous people seem to have more of an affinity to being able to do because they've had to live under colonialism?
Yeah, I think the short answer is I think so. I'm hopeful for that. I mean, colonialism has been with us as a country since the country was formed and before. This conversation about reconciliation and true reconciliation, what it means for our country, it's been with us perhaps 10 to 15 years. And what I believe happens when people are confronted with issues, and reconciliation, the issues of Indigenous peoples are foregrounded for society at large, it creates some confusion, it creates some concern, and I think importantly it creates within so many people that I've talked to the desire to learn and understand more, to be able to break down those walls and silos that you talk about. So I think more than ever, particularly thinking back when I was the regional chief for British Columbia, more than ever before, people are engaged in this conversation. And that to me is progress. And it's through those discussions with individuals in their own lives that are going to break down those silos and be able for us to tell a shared story of Canada.
Is there a limit to it, though, for how far people are willing to go? And again, I'm talking about, the colonists, which are, or the colonizers who are, reconciliation sounds great. We should do that as long as it doesn't affect my fee simple property. Yeah,
for sure. And that's a challenge. And it's a great concern for me in terms of reconciliation is talked about a lot, and that's a good thing. But many people, in particular politics, tend to label everything or nearly everything as an act of reconciliation, which basically means that nothing is reconciliation. Like I call it performative or symbolic reconciliation. And that's the fear that I have, wherein some people think that we've achieved reconciliation when we're just sort of scratching the surface on this, what I like to call a marathon. We are making progress, but we need to actually break down that fear and understand where that comes from, or that ignorance, moving past the denial of Indigenous people's rights to an era of the recognition of it.
Yeah, do we worry that in some cases, we probably see this in the United States more than we do in Canada, but we do hear it as a dog whistle in Canada, the being proud of our history instead of, embarrassed about our history, or, that's is there a backlash to this? I mean, we have Joe Biden making an unprecedented apology to what we call Native Americans right now. That's a big step forward for the United States, something they haven't seen before. And at the same time, you've got a political climate down there, and here I would argue that there's a backlash to some of even just the conversations taking place.
Yeah, and I think that, I agree with you. I think, one, it's important that people are even engaged in discussions, however narrow-minded or based in denialism those conversations might be. I mean, one can argue that is a little bit of progress in terms of people having the discussion. But the reality is, and what we try to accomplish in the book is actually telling the story of the history of Canada from the perspective of many different people, including Indigenous peoples. We have to come to a place and time where we confront the fear that exists in many people about what I've heard since I was a treaty commissioner, I'm going to lose my home. I mean, that simply is not the case. What we're trying to do as Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples is to come together to reconcile, which is an overused term, but actually create the space for Indigenous peoples in this country to rebuild their nations, to be self-governing, to enjoy the fundamental human rights which every other Canadian enjoys. Why is this not the case for Indigenous people? So I think for those people that fear or are against Indigenous reconciliation, understanding the basic human rights that you enjoy are the human rights right now that Indigenous peoples do not enjoy to the same extent, and we need to correct that.
Can we talk federal politics for a second?
I can't imagine. I didn't imagine you'd want to ask that or ask about it. Surprise.
You knew that was coming. What do you think about what's going on in the Liberal caucus right now?
Oh, goodness. I can tell you this, and I know I've sat across the table from you and talked about federal politics when I was in it, but I'm pretty pleased that I'm not in it right now. I find it really upsetting and alarming. I look to the discussions that are happening within the Liberal caucus and around the Prime Minister, and I think the time should have come quite some time ago for the Prime Minister to take his graceful exit and to enable somebody else to take the reins of that party.
What do you see happening when we finally do get to a federal election?
Honestly, right now, I think about the provincial election that just happened, and I look at it as like a kind of the equivalent of scrolling through Twitter, and I fear that in terms of the federal election, we're kind of descending into the same place. And at the root of this, at the base of it, the challenge for me is the issue of partisanship and how that has continues to overtake our politics, and that quells discussions about the important issues of our time that need to be addressed as much as possible from a collective perspective.
You seem to be in a really good place doing what you're doing right now. No, you don't entertain any thoughts of going back into it?
I'm in the place where I'm supposed to be. I'm very happy. That's not to say that at some point I believe, and it might sound corny, I believe in callings, and I believe that there might be one for me to get back involved in politics. I can see a path potentially for that, but right now I'm super happy to be launching this book with my dear friend and longtime colleague, Rochelle Donnet.
Yeah, you know what you've just said is going to be turned into Jody Wilson-Raybould is not ruling out. Fill in the blank.
I'm not afraid of those kind of headlines. I have a heart that believes fundamentally in public service, and where I can exercise and use my voice to improve the quality of life for people, that's what I'm going to do.
So good to see you. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I look forward. I have not made it all the way through the book. I look forward to making it all the way.
Let me know how I'll sign that copy for you.
I would love that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
you.
Jody Wilson-Raybould, lawyer, author, former politician, a recovered politician who served as a federal justice minister and attorney general. Reconciling History, a story of Canada. The launch takes place this Sunday, West Vancouver Memorial Library.